Welcome to my video series, Defining Heavy Metal. If you're new to heavy metal, or maybe you've been following a few of those reaction channels that have become so popular on YouTube recently, some of the terms can be confusing. Metal is a genre that has spawned so many subcategories that even the most die-hard fan can have trouble keeping up with all of them. I've been listening to metal since I was a teenager in the late 80s, and my head still spins from all the different terms used. When I first started working on this project, I never intended it to be a history of heavy metal video, but rather just a short description of the various metal subgenres. It was intended for people who are not familiar with metal and all of its different branches. But as I worked on it, what quickly became apparent was that at least some knowledge of metal and its history was needed to describe how these genres came to be. A short video project quickly turned into a small series. This still won't be a full in-depth history lesson, but I will try to at least cover the basics. I'll keep things as brief as possible, but there's a lot to cover. If you'd rather skip the initial history lesson and just go straight to the subgenre discussion, then just skip ahead to part 2. Otherwise, let's get to it. Metal can be difficult to describe to someone who isn't familiar with it, as it shares a lot of common aspects with rock. Over the decades, the line between metal and rock has blurred so much, it's often difficult to distinguish the two. It can very much be a "I know it when I hear it" kind of thing, and no two people will completely agree on what is or isn't metal. And when you start to get into the different subgenres, well, the lines become even more blurred. A single song is not enough to accurately describe what a subgenre is. Even a single album or a single band doesn't really encompass every aspect of that subgenre. And in fact, very few bands ever fit neatly into just a singular category. Virtually every band will have some sort of crossover that would place them in a different category. It could be a single song or an entire album, or just multiple aspects of their songwriting that is commonly shared between other subgenres. For example, I could tell you that Metallica is a thrash metal band, but if you were to listen to For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Thing That Should Not Be, The Unforgiven, Sad But True, and The Outlaw Torn, all Metallica songs, you would still have no idea what thrash metal was, because none of those would be considered an example of a thrash metal song. A core element of thrash is fast tempos, but many thrash bands would eventually break away from this mold as they would experiment with different musical elements. In some cases, bands will go through multiple changes in their music style over the course of their career. Celtic Frost started out playing more thrash and death metal before moving into some experimentation, and then they would switch to a glam metal style before switching once more to some blackened thrash doom metal hybrid. We'll get more into the different styles later, but for now, just remember that when we're talking about these subgenres and which bands fit where, they're more like guidelines than actual rules. My goal here is to list some of the more common subgenres of metal with a brief description of some of the key elements and how they came about, and then give you a handful of bands that would fit into that category. By listening to a group of different bands from the same subgenre, it'll give you a much better representation of that style of music, rather than just picking out a single song or two. And before you run down to the comments to type, "Hey, but what about..." I'm sorry if I don't mention your favorite band, or get around to the obscure neo-classical, techno, melodic, progressive, death metal, mathcore subgenre. There's just far too many examples, and it's impossible to cover them all. The whole idea of using these subgenres to begin with is just so that if you identify a band that you do like, it's much easier to find more bands that share similar style. And again, there will be some crossover. They don't all fit neatly into just one category. Remember, guidelines, not rules. With that said, I do feel like in order to better understand all of the different types of metal, we have to first define what heavy metal is. Because what was considered metal in the 80s may not sound anything like metal from today. Just like building a house, you need to start with a solid foundation. So understanding how heavy metal started and creating a baseline for what heavy metal is important. Okay, so then, who invented heavy metal? The answer? No one. There was no magic switch that someone flipped on and suddenly, poof, metal was born. Like most musical genres, heavy metal evolved. Early blues, rock, and jazz would begin to combine different musical elements that would spawn into new genres of their own. Psychedelic rock would take experimentations further and develop new techniques and sounds. All of these would eventually find their way into what would become metal. And I'm sorry here, Blue Cheer fans, but no, they did not invent heavy metal. Blue Cheer played blues with an injection of rock really loud. But this, in and of itself, wasn't a new genre. It was just blues rock played really loud. Now, I'm not trying to turn this into a Blue Cheer bash fest. It's just that they weren't really doing anything unique or different that would define them as a whole new genre. This was the late 60s, and virtually every other major musical act was experimenting with louder guitars, overdriven amps, fuzzy distortion, faster tempos, and screaming vocals. All of these elements would find their way into metal, but none of these bands had managed to separate themselves into a new music genre just yet. Black Sabbath would be the band that would define what heavy metal was, at least initially. And even though their first album contained songs that would be considered groundbreaking for the time, the rest of that first album was still very much stuck in their blues and jazz roots. Now, the entire album was recorded in just one day, and as a result, it very much feels like a band just going through an improv jam session with a couple of original songs tossed in for good measure. It still lacks some cohesiveness as a whole, but they would address that with their next two albums. Paranoid and Master of Reality would be the albums that laid the foundation for all metal that followed. If you were to pick a place to start your metal journey, this would be as good of a place as any. This wasn't just a one-off song done as an experiment. This was a deliberate shift by the entire band to be something different, something darker. Sabbath would combine all of the elements that would define heavy metal into one complete package, from start to finish. Heavy distortion with down-tuned guitars, blistering drums and powerful bass, haunting vocals, riffs that were fast, riffs that were slow and evil sounding, rhythms that grooved, tempo changes, lyrics that covered topics such as war, politics, the occult, fantasy, death, drugs, and of course, there was the imagery. Of course, this was still the 70s and some of their onstage clothing would be questionable, but bringing all of these elements together and achieving a degree of mainstream success along with it is why Black Sabbath would be the band to define heavy metal, a term that wasn't even used to describe music yet. And they weren't alone. Fellow Birmingham rockers, Judas Priest, were busy molding their own brand of metal, and were one of the first bands to actually embrace the term heavy metal as a genre. Early albums were still very much a mix of rock and blues, but they soon found their own style in the form of aggressive dual guitars and introducing leather and spikes to the metal world. Other bands from the 70s would play a huge role in influencing future generations of metal musicians. Acts like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Rainbow, and Kiss, although considered more rock than metal, would have a lasting impression on many bands to come. The face paint and theatrics of Kiss, Alice Cooper, and Merciful Fate's King Diamond, as well as horror punk band The Misfits, would leave a distinct mark on many metal acts. When Black Sabbath replaced singer Ozzy Osbourne with former Rainbow vocalist Ronnie James Dio, the band would reinvent themselves with a much broader sound on their 1980 album Heaven and Hell, once again cementing themselves in the history books of heavy metal. By this point, heavy metal was very much its own living, breathing entity, and it was primed for an evolution. So, now that we've defined heavy metal and its origins, hopefully you have a better understanding of what heavy metal is, at least in its broadest terms. Now, we're going to dive into the individual subgenres that spawned from that main branch, and we'll start with traditional metal. Thanks for watching, and make sure to check out part 2 of the series.